Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're not just reading the headlines, we are trying to read the water.
The water in the Persian Gulf specifically.
Right, exactly. If you pull up a map right now, that specific body of water is basically holding the breath of the entire planet.
It really is.
It feels like we're watching this massive high-stakes game of chess, but the pieces are nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and the board is one of the most volatile regions on Earth.
Yeah, and it's a situation where the line between a strategic bluff and total war is becoming incredibly thin, like maybe even invisible at this point.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about a diplomatic spat or, some targeted sanctions here. We're talking about the potential for a conflict that could fundamentally reshape global energy, global alliances, and really the balance of power for the next century. It's that serious.
It is, and to help us navigate this incredibly complex situation,
Right.
we are leaning heavily on the insights of Mookie Tenenbaum.
Right.
Now, Mookie Tenenbaum is an international observer who views these kinds of conflicts through a very specific, very analytical lens. He kind of strips away the ideological noise and looks at the raw mechanics of it all, the leverage, the psychology, the actual hardware being moved around.
And what's really fascinating here is that Mookie argues we're witnessing a before and after moment in history right now.
A paradigm shift.
Exactly. He actually compares the shift we're seeing in geopolitics to the advent of artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow.
And think about how AI just fundamentally changed how we look at the economy or technology. Like one day it wasn't there, and the next day the old ways of doing things were just completely obsolete.
Right, overnight.
Well, Mookie Tenenbaum believes we are seeing a similar paradigm shift in how international relations are conducted. The old rule book is basically being thrown out the window.
That is a massive claim to make. I mean, usually geopolitics moves at the speed of a glacier, right?
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. If the old rules are gone, what exactly are the new rules? And more importantly, who is rewriting them? Because Mookie has a very specific analogy for the man at the center of this storm.
Donald Trump?
Right. And just to be clear, for you listening at home, we aren't taking any political sides here.
No, definitely not.
We're not endorsing Trump's policies or anyone's policies. We are purely acting as a neutral lens to break down the analysis that Mookie provides, just conveying the ideas from his perspective.
Right. We're just unpacking the strategy. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you look at it through the lens of game theory. Mookie Tenenbaum refers to Trump as the Joker in the deck.
The Joker.
Yeah. And he doesn't mean that in a comedic sense, like a court jester. He means it in the structural sense of a wild card.
Like in poker or whatever. The card that can be absolutely anything. The card that changes the value of every single other card on the table the second it gets played.
Precisely. Physically and strategically. Mookie notes that Trump changes the rules of engagement. In traditional geopolitics, the stuff they teach at the Kennedy School of Government, you usually have two distinct linear options when you're dealing with an adversary.
Okay.
Option A is to threaten. You try to dissuade them, you show a little muscle, you issue a sternly worded statement, maybe move a single destroyer a little closer to their coast.
Right, it's an escalation ladder. You climb the ladder one rung at a time, you threaten, and if that doesn't work then, and really only then, do you move to option B, which is to actually attack.
Usually, yes. It's a very linear progression, A then B. But Mookie Tenenbaum points out that in this unique scenario with Iran, Trump has basically flipped the script entirely.
How so?
He has done everything physically necessary to attack.
Yeah.
He's mobilized a force so massive that it looks like the invasion has already started. And he's doing this specifically in order to dissuade.
Wait, so he's deploying an actual invasion force to prevent an invasion?
Yeah.
That sounds completely paradoxical.
It is the paradox of dissuasion through overwhelming force. It's not, if you do this, I will hit you. It's, I am already winding up a punch right now, try to stop me.
Wow.
Let's look at the actual hardware Mookie highlights, because the scale of this is actually mind-boggling when you drill down into the military specs. The U.S. has deployed 2 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers to the region.
Okay, for the folks listening who aren't naval gazers or military buffs, put that in context. How big of a deal is moving 2 carriers?
It is a massive deal. The United States only has 11 of these supercarriers in total active service for the entire globe.
11 for the whole world.
Right. We are likely talking about ships like the USS Abraham Lincoln or the USS Theodore Roosevelt. These aren't just big boats. They are floating cities.
Powered by nuclear reactors.
Exactly. Committing 2 of them to one specific geographic zone along with their entire carrier strike groups.
And a strike group is what exactly?
It's the entourage.
Hmm.
It means guided missile destroyers, Cruisers, logistic ships, and likely multiple attack submarines lurking underneath. It is a colossal projection of power.
And Mookie mentioned this is unprecedented, right?
In the last 40 or 50 years, yes. We just haven't seen this specific concentration of firepower used in this exact way. It screams war. But the goal, according to Mookie Tenenbaum's analysis, is to prepare for war so visibly, so undeniably, that the war itself becomes unnecessary.
Because the other side realizes they have absolutely no chance.
Exactly. Iran looks at that armada and realizes they have absolutely no path to victory.
It's like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight, loading it right in front of the guy and pointing it at his chest just to make sure he drops his pocket knife.
That is the exact psychology. But while all this heavy metal is floating in the Gulf, there's a whole other layer of activity happening in the shadows. We have this really intense diplomatic dance going on.
Right, because usually when the big guns come out, the diplomats pack up and go home. But here they seem to be working overtime.
It is extremely chaotic. And Mookie highlights the totally mixed signals we're seeing right now. On one hand, you have these back-channel negotiations happening in Geneva.
With Oman, right.
Yeah, Oman is acting as the mediator here. Oman is traditionally the Switzerland of the Middle East. They're the go-between for the West and Tehran. And the mediators came out of those recent meetings saying things went well, they were projecting optimism.
But the U.S. side.
Complete radio silence.
Which usually means things are going terribly, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. Mookie suggests this silence might actually be a good sign in high-stakes diplomacy. If you're shouting to the press, you're usually posturing for the public. If you're quiet, you might actually be cutting a real deal behind closed doors.
Okay, I see.
But here is the curveball that really makes me question the good news narrative. The Prime Minister of Oman isn't just resting on a successful meeting. He is flying directly to the U.S.
Oh.
And he's not just meeting with any mid-level diplomat. He's going to convince J.D. Vance to keep the negotiations alive.
J.D. Vance. Which suggests things aren't nearly as secure as the mediators are pretending to the press. If you have to fly all the way to the U.S. to convince the vice president or the administration to just keep talking, that implies the U.S. is fully ready to walk away from the table.
Exactly. It implies the exit sign is flickering and the U.S. has one foot out the door, and then you add the cherry on top of all this confusion. Mookie points out that the U.S. ambassador to Israel issued a very specific warning to Americans.
I saw that. He told them to leave Israel via commercial flights immediately. It wasn't the usual vague travel advisory, like be aware of your surroundings. It was incredibly explicit.
Right. It wasn't reconsider your travel plans for the holidays. It was get out right now while the commercial planes are still taking off. That is a terrifyingly specific instruction.
So what's your take based on Mookie's framework? Is that a bluff? Is it part of this Joker strategy to just freak out Iran and apply maximum psychological pressure? Or is it a genuine we are about to start shooting warning?
That is the beauty. And honestly, the horror of the strategy Mookie Tenenbaum is describing here. You cannot know for sure. And if we don't know sitting here analyzing it, Iran certainly doesn't know.
The uncertainty is the weapon.
Exactly. This cultivated uncertainty is a weapon in itself. It forces the adversary to assume the absolute worst-case scenario.
Which brings us to a really crucial comparison that Mookie makes in his analysis. We have seen the U.S. play this exact kind of pressure game before, most notably recently with Venezuela.
Right.
But Mookie is very, very clear on this point. Iran is not Venezuela. Why is this distinction so critical? Why can't the U.S. just copy and paste the Caracas playbook to Tehran?
It all comes down to the fundamental psychology of the opponent. Mookie breaks it down like this. In Venezuela, the leadership, Maduro and his inner circle, they lack a deep-seated fanatical ideology.
They aren't zealots.
No, they are essentially a criminal enterprise that happens to be running a state. Their primary goal is simply survival.
Right. They want to keep their stolen money, they want to keep their power, and most importantly, they want to stay out of a jail cell. It's a purely transactional mindset.
Exactly. Mookie notes that for the Venezuelan regime, the absolute worst-case scenario is jail, or maybe seeking political asylum in a friendly country. They have skin in the game, sure, but it's a very worldly kind of survival. They are corrupt, not celestial.
So you can buy them off.
Right. If you offer them a nice beach house in Turkey and full immunity, they might actually take it. There's a price.
But Iran?
Iran is an ideological abyss. Mookie explains that for the Iranian leadership, losing doesn't mean a comfortable exile on a beach or even a cozy minimum security prison cell. It means hanging.
Hanging, like literally executed.
Yes. In Iran, the internal stakes are brutal. If the regime falls, they lose their lives, they lose their families, they lose absolutely everything. They are fighting for their literal physical existence in a way that Maduro simply wasn't.
Wow.
But Mookie adds another even more dangerous layer to this, the celestial factor.
The religious aspect of the regime.
Right. This is so crucial to understand. Khamenei isn't just a political dictator in a suit. He is the supreme leader. He genuinely believes he has celestial hosts behind him.
Divine backing.
Exactly. When you truly believe you are acting on behalf of the divine, typical political pressure just doesn't work the same way. The threat of economic sanctions is annoying to them, sure, but the threat of divine punishment or the promise of divine reward makes their ideology so much harder to break than standard Venezuelan corruption.
Right. You can bribe a crook, but you can't really bribe someone who thinks they're a prophet.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
You cannot negotiate with a celestial mandate using worldly threats.
And there is a massive, massive difference in their actual capacity for damage, too. Venezuela was largely a local problem. It was a tragedy for the people living there and highly annoying for the South American region. But Maduro wasn't going to blow up the global economy.
Mookie Tenenbaum emphasizes this point heavily. Iran is a global threat. They have the physical ability to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is huge.
We are talking about a geographic choke point through which 25% of the entire world's oil supply passes every single day.
Let's pause on that for a second. Let's really think about that. If they mine that strait or sink ships in it, what actually happens?
The global economy essentially goes into cardiac arrest. Oil prices would skyrocket instantly. Supply chains would freeze globally. It's not just about paying more for gas at the pump. It's about the cost of everything that moves on a truck or a ship.
Food, medicine, everything.
Everything. Plus, Iran has a global sleeper network. They can execute terrorist strikes all over the world.
Yeah.
Venezuela had a few allies left, but Iran has deeply entrenched proxies. Look at the Houthis.
Right, the Houthis in Yemen.
Mookie reminds us that the Houthis are essentially just Iranian extensions. They are fully capable of striking international shipping lanes and critical infrastructure. They can touch you almost anywhere in the region.
So we have incredibly high stakes, a fanatical enemy with global reach, and a U.S. force poised to strike. But the U.S. isn't actually trying to invade and occupy Tehran, are they? Like, this isn't going to be Iraq 2.0.
No, not at all.
Mookie uses a very specific, very vivid, and honestly kind of shocking term for the U.S. policy here. He calls it castration.
Yeah, it's a jarring term. It actively makes you wince when you hear it.
It really does. But let's look at why he uses that specific word.
Mookie defines castration as a policy where the U.S. is deliberately not seeking regime change in the traditional sense. They aren't trying to go in and fix human rights in Tehran. They aren't trying to install a Western-style democracy or liberate women from the oppressive modesty laws there.
Which I think might sound very cold to some of the listeners. We usually like our foreign policy wrapped in this warm moral language about freedom and democracy.
It is ice cold. It is pure realpolitik. The underlying logic from the U.S. side is basically do what you want to your own people. That is your own internal tragedy. But you will absolutely not have the physical ability to threaten us or the outside world ever again.
So taking away their fangs.
Exactly. The goal is to neuter the regime's external power, to make them completely impotent on the world stage.
So what does a castrated Iran actually look like on paper? Like, what are the specific demands currently on the table?
Mookie lists 3 absolute non-negotiables that the U.S. is demanding. Demand number 1 is nuclear zero.
Meaning no nuclear bomb, obviously.
Meaning no capability to even make a bomb. No uranium enrichment whatsoever. Ever.
Zero centrifuges spinning.
Right. If they claim they need nuclear fuel for civilian energy grids, fine. They have to buy it from Russia or the U.S. They cannot possess the domestic technology or the infrastructure to enrich it themselves. It forces total dependency.
Okay, demand number 2.
Missile range. Mookie notes that Iran currently has ballistic missiles like the Shahab or the Sijil series that can easily reach Italy and India. And they are aggressively developing new ones to reach even further into Central Europe.
Right.
The U.S. demand is very simple. You cannot have missiles that reach beyond your immediate geographic neighbors. You want short-range air defense, sure, but you lose the long arm. You lose the ability to strike a NATO capital.
And the third demand.
End proxy support. Stop funding and arming the Houthis. Stop funding Hezbollah. Stop funding Hamas. Cut the financial and military cords to all the marionettes in the region.
It's basically stripping them of every single tool they use to project fear and power. But here's my biggest question with this whole strategy. Is there anyone in the Iranian government to even negotiate this kind of massive surrender with? I mean, Supreme Leader Khamenei is in his 80s. He's reportedly ill. Who's next in line?
That is exactly the critical problem Mookie identifies. There is a massive power vacuum. Mookie points out there is no clear vice leader ready to take the reins.
What about his son? I read his son was powerful.
His son, Mojtaba, is largely a symbol. He's not a seasoned political operator with deep independent support. There is no designated successor who has the absolute authority to step up to a microphone and say, okay, the game is up. Let's make a deal with the Americans to save the furniture.
Right. So there's no pragmatic Henry Kissinger type waiting in the wings to negotiate a peace treaty.
Exactly. There's no pragmatist there. This complete lack of a clear, rational alternative makes the castration strategy the only viable option the U.S. sees besides total all-out war. They feel they have to break the military capabilities physically because they simply cannot trust the leadership transition diplomatically.
Now, if this actually turns into a shooting war or a castration operation, as Mookie calls it, it's not just the U.S. doing all the heavy lifting, right? Mookie Tenenbaum describes this as a highly integrated joint venture with a very specific partner, Israel.
Yes, and this is where the logistics get absolutely fascinating. Mookie views a potential conflict not as a solo U.S. war, but as a U.S.-Israel joint operation. And he actually puts a hard number on the value of that. He says involving Israel saves the United States roughly 20 to 70% in total resources.
20 to 30%. That is billions upon billions of dollars, not to mention the manpower and the risk. But what exactly does Israel bring to the table that the U.S. military machine doesn't already have? I mean, the U.S. has the aircraft carriers we just talked about. The U.S. has the most advanced satellite network on Earth.
Satellites are great, but Israel has the extreme granularity. They have the local intimate knowledge. Mookie details how Israeli intelligence has thoroughly infiltrated Iran on the ground level. We're talking about extensive human intelligence, actual people walking the streets of Tehran and Isfahan. Spies, operatives, assets. They physically paint targets for drones. But the most shocking detail Mookie shared in his analysis was about the missile silos themselves.
Oh, this part completely blew my mind when I read it. Explain the sabotage aspect.
Okay, so Mookie says that Israeli intelligence has people who can literally sabotage Iranian missile silos so that the missiles explode upon launch.
Inside the tube.
Yes. Just imagine being an Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander. You get the order to strike, you press the big red button, and instead of your ballistic missile flying out to hit Tel Aviv, it detonates right there in the tube, taking out the entire launch crew, the facility, and the surrounding infrastructure.
That is psychological warfare on a completely different level. You literally can't trust your own weapon systems. You can't trust the guy who wired the control panel.
Precisely. It induces total paranoia. It's not just bombing them from the air. It's hacking the infrastructure and physically tampering with the weapon systems from the inside out. Cyber warfare is a massive, silent component of this. It's a shadow war that happens long before the first jet engine even starts.
Speaking of jets, Mookie mentioned something about the F-35 fighter jets that I had no idea about.
Right, the F-35 Adir. Adir is the Hebrew name they use for it. Israel is the only country in the entire world that is officially allowed by the U.S. to modify the American F-35 jets.
Which is crazy because usually when you buy a highly classified jet from the U.S., it's like buying an iPhone, right? You absolutely cannot mess with the internal software. It is totally locked down.
You break the warranty if you open it up.
And in this case, worse than the warranty, you break the military alliance.
But Israel actually has explicit permission to jailbreak it, essentially. They install their own proprietary electronic warfare suites, their own classified communication pods. Mookie suggests their specific version of the F-35 might actually be technologically superior to the standard American one because it is custom-tuned by Israeli engineers for this exact hostile environment.
That is wild. But here is a piece of intelligence, a rumor really, that caught my attention even more than the jets. Mookie mentions something about Chinese intelligence spotting U.S. aircraft in a very unexpected location.
This is a really juicy detail, and it completely changes the strategic calculus. According to Mookie Tenenbaum's, Chinese spy satellites have allegedly spotted U.S. military aircraft stationed directly at Israeli air bases.
Now, why is that such a massive big deal? Allies use each other's military bases all the time, don't they?
Not in this specific context. Historically, for intense political reasons, the U.S. does not base its attack aircraft directly in Israel. They use the carriers floating out at sea, or they use massive bases in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or Turkey.
Right, to keep a little distance.
Yes, to maintain an illusion of separation in the Arab world. Putting U.S. warplanes physically on Israeli soil sends a huge dual message. Message one is we are literally fighting from the exact same runway.
No daylight between us. And message two.
It's a calculated bluff to force Iran to negotiate by showing a completely united front that is physically integrated. It completely removes any plausible deniability. If Iran decides to launch a strike on that Israeli base, they are now hitting the Israeli Air Force and the U.S. Air Force simultaneously.
Oh, wow. So it forces Iran to either fight both superpowers at once or fight neither. It's a brilliant trap. Now let's zoom out a bit. We've got the U.S. and Israel locked in on one side and Iran on the other. But this is a global chessboard. Where are the other major geopolitical players in all this? Where's Russia? Where's China?
Well, if Iran was sitting around hoping for a dramatic rescue from the superpowers, Mookie Tenenbaum has some very bad news for them. Let's start with Russia. According to Mookie, Russia is completely tied up.
In Ukraine.
Right. He notes that even during the winter months, which is historically when the Russian army digs trenches and holds the frozen line, they're actually losing territory in Ukraine.
He mentioned a specific figure regarding that, didn't he?
Yeah, he pointed out that Ukraine recently reclaimed about 200 square kilometers.
Wow.
That is highly unusual for winter warfare in that specific region. It shows a severe depletion of Russian strength and resources.
So Russia is way too busy trying to hold on to its own borders to throw a lifeline to Iran.
Exactly. I mean, sure, they did some minor naval exercises with Iran recently. I think it was like 3 boats and 1 submarine. But Mookie calls it purely symbolic. It's a photo op for state TV. They absolutely cannot project real military power to save Tehran when they're bleeding troops and tanks in the Donbass every day.
Okay, makes sense. And what about China? I mean, Iran sells a massive amount of cheap oil to China. You would think Beijing would be highly motivated to protect its favorite gas station.
You'd think so, but Mookie says it is game over for any Chinese military intervention. China is absolutely terrified of 2 specific things right now: their own failing domestic economy and Donald Trump.
They really don't want another massive trade war, do they?
They know Trump is actively looking for a reason to hit them with economic hammers. Huge tariff sweeping sanctions. Stepping in to militarily save Iran from the U.S. would be painting a giant target on their own economic back. They simply won't do it. They will let Iran fall to save their own export markets.
So Iran is truly isolated. But what about Europe? Usually European leaders are the first ones at the microphone being very vocal about de-escalation, upholding international law, avoiding war at all costs.
Total silence. And Mookie finds this absolute silence very telling. Leaders like Emmanuel Macron in France, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Pedro Sanchez in Spain, they're saying virtually nothing about this massive buildup.
Why? Is it just fear?
Fear of Trump's economic wrath, primarily. Mookie argues that these European leaders care much more about avoiding crushing U.S. tariffs and funding cuts than they care about the nuances of international law regarding preemptive strikes on the Iranian regime. They're collectively keeping their heads down.
Plus, Mookie highlighted a very direct physical threat to Europe, right?
Yes, Iranian ballistic missiles can reach parts of southern and eastern Europe. They could potentially target U.S. bases located in Italy or Greece. But Mookie makes a really astute point here regarding public opinion.
What's the point?
If Iran actually attacks a European city just to cause panic and drag them into it, it would likely backfire spectacularly.
Right.
It wouldn't make Europe surrender and beg for peace. It would turn European public opinion instantly and violently against Iran.
Right.
It would essentially hand the U.S. and Israel a blank check from the international community to just finish the job. So Europe sits in nervous silence, hoping the storm passes overhead without them getting wet.
It really is amazing how effective fear is as a silencer on the global stage.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears and talk about the economic fallout. If this goes completely sideways, or even if this castration operation proceeds as planned, what happens economically, specifically with the global oil supply?
The Strait of Hormuz is the primary danger zone, as we discussed. If Iran decides to mine it as a last resort, oil prices will inevitably spike. But Mookie is surprisingly optimistic about the world's resilience here.
Really? Optimistic about a major war in the Persian Gulf? That seems counterintuitive.
He's optimistic about the timeline. He suggests the global market is much better prepared with massive strategic oil reserves than it used to be during, say, the crises in the 1970s. We have a lot more oil physically stored up underground. A conflict, in his view, would likely be relatively short. He estimates roughly 30 to 60 days of intense disruption.
So we aren't looking at a 10-year grinding war.
No. It would be painful, yes. Gas prices would hurt. But it wouldn't be an endless quagmire that permanently destroys the global economy. He sees it as a very sharp shock, followed by a global reset.
Now, Mookie Tenenbaum is a global observer, and he always keeps a very close eye on Latin America. And he sees the ripples of this Middle East conflict reaching all the way down there. We definitely need to spend some time on this because usually Latin America is treated as a total afterthought in Middle East geopolitical discussions, but Mookie connects them directly.
He does. He sees the castration policy as a truly global strategy. Look at Cuba, for example.
What is happening in Cuba right now in relation to this?
Mookie describes Cuba as having effectively accepted its own castration already. They are currently receiving U.S. oil.
Wait, U.S. oil is flowing directly to Cuba?
Yes. And Mookie interprets this as a clear, undeniable sign of absolute submission. You don't willingly take oil shipments from your historical archenemy unless you have completely given up the fight.
Right.
Their tourism industry is completely dead due to the constant rolling blackouts. Their power grid is totally failing. They have capitulated just to survive day to day. They are no longer a defiant geopolitical player spreading revolution. They are basically a ward of the state.
And what about Venezuela? We talked about Maduro earlier, but what is the actual status of that regime right now?
Stagnant. Completely frozen. Mookie suggests that the only realistic way out for Venezuela at this point is a truth commission, South African style.
Oh, like what they did after apartheid fell, where you confess your political crimes in exchange for full amnesty.
Exactly that model.
Yeah.
But he admits that cultural differences make that outcome highly unlikely in South America. The Latin American political culture historically demands vengeance and prison time for losers, not peaceful reconciliation.
Yeah.
So they're just stuck in this miserable limbo. And Nicaragua, he sees the Ortega regime prepping to quietly surrender or submit next. The U.S. pressure campaign is quietly working across the board.
But then he went on this wild tangent about Peru that I absolutely loved reading. It is such a weird geopolitical paradox, and we have to dig into it. The Peru paradox.
It's hilarious, honestly. Mookie actually compares Peru to Belgium.
Belgium, the place famous for waffles and chocolate.
And the place that famously functioned for over a year with literally no official government in charge. Mookie points out that Peru currently has massive, deeply entrenched political instability. Look at their last few years. Presidents end up in jail, they end up dead by suicide, they get impeached constantly. The political sphere is an absolute disaster zone.
It's a complete revolving door of constitutional crisis.
And yet, look at their actual economic numbers. The economy is absolutely booming. Gold, copper, fish meal. Their exports are flying out of the ports. The currency is remarkably stable compared to all its neighbors.
How is that even remotely possible when the government is collapsing every Tuesday?
It's like the national economy and the national politics got a divorce. Mookie points out that the central bank and the major export sectors function on complete autopilot. The technocrats just run things. It is a country that functions economically completely despite its politics. It's a rare bright spot in his geopolitical analysis, showing that sometimes if you just let the raw economy run and completely ignore the politicians shouting on TV, things actually work out fine.
I love that so much. We don't have a functioning president, but hey, look at our record copper exports this quarter.
Yeah.
Now, before we start to wrap this up, Mookie threw in one last bonus conflict, just in case the Middle East wasn't complicated enough already.
Right, the sudden conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
What exactly is happening over there?
Mookie mentions a localized war breaking out right on the border between them. And he calls it coincidental with incredibly heavy sarcasm.
Why the sarcasm? Does he think it's orchestrated?
Because of the deep regional alliances. Pakistan is a traditional strong ally of Iran. Afghanistan currently, under Taliban rule, is a bitter enemy of Iran. Having those two fight right now serves as a massive distraction. It complicates the whole regional map.
It pulls attention and troops away from the Gulf.
It ties up regional resources. But Mookie says the Western world is largely ignoring it because all eyes are glued to the carriers in the Gulf. It's a geopolitical sideshow, but a very bloody one.
So bringing it all back to the absolute center of the board, we have Trump operating like a ruthless corporate CEO, buying, selling, and changing massive policies rapidly. We have Iran facing a truly existential, fanatical threat. And we have Mookie Tenenbaum's core analysis that this is all a massive play to permanently change the rules of the international game.
Mookie truly believes Trump acts like a CEO in a hostile takeover. He's totally unpredictable. He's hyper-transactional. Iran interprets Trump's aggressive rhetoric, his claims that we won't hold back. They interpret that as typical political posturing. But Mookie warns that Iran might be severely miscalculating. They might think they can just wait him out in bunkers, but Trump's sheer unpredictability is his greatest weapon. You literally cannot strategize against a guy who might decide to flip the entire board tomorrow morning.
And the ultimate question Mookie poses, which I found terrifying, is this. Is Trump really trying to dissuade Iran? Or is he actually trying to dissuade China?
That is the truly scary thought underpinning all of this.
Explain that for the listener. Why China?
Because China is the real peer competitor. They are the real long-term enemy in the struggle for global dominance. Mookie questions if Trump is simply making an example of Iran, like an incredibly violent demo reel, just saying, look what I can do to them in a matter of days. Imagine what I can do to your economy and your navy. If Iran is just the bloody example to show Beijing exactly what happens when you cross the U.S., then the level of military destruction unleashed could be much, much higher than what is strictly necessary just to neutralize Iran's nukes.
So we are left with this tense concept of castration versus total war. But here is a final, highly provocative thought to leave you with, based entirely on Mookie's insights today.
The Phantom Menace theory.
A phantom menace. If the U.S. and Israel have truly fully infiltrated Iran's weapons and missile systems, if they can actually make deep underground silos explode on command and paint targets using spies from the inside, is the threat of an Iranian nuclear war actually real anymore? Or are we all just watching a grand theatrical production?
Meaning the outcome is already totally decided.
Meaning that the very moment an Iranian order is given, the systems just fail. The war might technically be over before it even officially starts because it was won 6 months ago by an Israeli line of code hidden in a server somewhere in Tehran. And the troops, the carriers, the fiery rhetoric, they're all just expensive props on a global stage designed to convince the world it was a fair fight.
That is a deeply haunting thought to end on. But it rings true to Mookie Tenenbaum's analysis. So for everyone listening, keep watching the price of a barrel of oil and watch the continued silence of those European leaders. Those are your true indicators of what happens next.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.